Welcome, everyone, to the afternoon session, Center for Strategic International Studies. My name is Seth Jones, the Director of the International Security Program. Just to give you a bit of a context as we shift gears in this discussion, we spent the morning talking about the threat landscape in Europe and the evolving threat landscape. We evolved into a discussion with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the senior levels of the Pentagon and their general assessment of where the military operations, the joint warfighting concept were headed, the evolution of warfare, and how the Joint Staff and the Secretary of Defense were also thinking about issues related to Europe, U.S. posture in Europe, and the evolving situation in Ukraine. So now we're shifting to issues of both challenges and opportunities in European defense, and then we'll finish the day on focusing on the industrial base. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Max Bergman. Max is the director of the CSIS Stewart Center in Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSIS. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you all for being here, for hopefully you're all fed and somewhat still awake, and for being in this room when it's a gorgeous day here in Washington, D.C. I'm very excited about this panel looking at the challenges of European security, and we have a great panel with us today. Let me introduce them briefly and we'll dive into the conversation. And for all of you watching online, you can submit questions online, and for all of you in the room, please use the QR code to submit questions, and we will get to some of those toward the end of the conversation. Let me introduce our esteemed panelists. To my left is General Chris Padilla. He's Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation at NATO. General Padilla joined the German Air Force as a cadet in 1984 to become a jet pilot and officer. General Padilla gained experience for 8 years as a fighter pilot before taking his first command as squadron commander of the first squad of that wing between 1996 and 1998. And he served in a series of postings within the German Ministry of Defense and the German Air Force. General Padilla was appointed as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia on July 7th of 2022, so been in the job for almost a year. And then to his left, we have Vice Admiral Hervé Blejean, Director General of the European Union Military Staff. Admiral Blejean has held a variety of senior positions in the French Navy and as part of multilateral security initiatives. He is the Director General of the EU's military staff. Additionally, he is the head of the EU military assistance mission in support of Ukraine, which trains Ukrainian service members to operate Western military platforms. And it is great to have you both, and I know that both of you had to travel here, and it's good to have both NATO and EU representatives here, German and French, but NATO and EU representatives. And then last but certainly not least is Heather Connolly. Welcome home. Heather, of course, sat in this chair for a number of years here at CSIS, but is now the 6th president of the German Marshall Fund. And Heather, also from 2001 to 2005, was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs with responsibility for U.S. bilateral relations with the countries of Northern and Central Europe, and brings a wealth of expertise. So maybe let's dive right in. For the past 20 years or so, we've been talking about the problems of European defense, of European security, and then now we suddenly have a conventional war in Europe, in Ukraine, and we're now more than a year on from the war. This has taught us a lot of lessons. It's also seen, I think, a really both impressive response from NATO, the EU, and the United States. And maybe we could start by sort of doing a backward-looking assessment of how did we do in response to this crisis. And maybe, General, I'll start with you and to sort of offer the NATO perspective.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you much for having me. And in addition to what has been said today throughout the morning already, and for those who have been at the dinner last night where Defense Secretary Esper was talking as well, I would like to make a few remarks in the beginning. Number one, in practical terms, what has happened? Of course, after the war started, from a European perspective, secure. But that time, General Todd Walters, he did everything he could to really go for a very good defense posture. They deployed, they enforced, vigilance was there. So a lot of things happened right away. And I think this also proves how NATO's response capabilities are and what we have done there. This is on, if you will, on practical terms, how NATO reacted to that from when the war started overall. But from a NATO strategic overall perspective, I think what happened then after, and it led up to Madrid summit. Because if you see Madrid summit and if you look at the strategic concept changed the way we think, the way we design, and the way we plan for the future. It has a complete new array, if you will, especially now with deterrence in defense. We might discuss that because now there is quite a focus now on deterrence. We had this morning, and I mean, even so, you see it in the strategic concept, this is a nuclear alliance, but deterrence is much more than just always thinking right away about nuclear issues. So there's a complete array to that. But the other tasks as well, when it comes to crisis response, crisis management, or security through partnership. So those are all the new aspects, if you will, out of the strategic concept. And this is where my headquarters, as you said, I'm sitting down in Norfolk, and the task we are having is we're looking in warfare development and looking out into the future. What does it mean for capabilities for NATO? NATO is nations, with the nations, so it's common funded what NATO can do, but 95% of the capabilities we do have is, of course, by nations. And this is what Secretary Esper last night said as well. Deterrence, and coming back to that, okay, it's capability and will. So the will is one issue you might discuss and how you do that overall, but capabilities, because, you know, with PowerPoint presentations, you don't scare off anyone at the end of the day. And this is really what we're looking at, because it's nice if you have all the concepts, if you have a lot of good ideas, but at the end of the day, the so what question from my headquarters perspective and then looking and discussing with the nations is always, so how we do we do it? So you see a lot of things have changed over time, and then just with the discussion we have on this panel, just let me make one more comment, because the European pillar of NATO, because this has changed, if you see throughout as it's designed and the way we go forward, and this is really something, and we are in very, very close coordination, and we are along the same lines there, because at the end of the day, it's all about cooperation and how do we get things closer in order to really succeed and strengthening the European pillar of NATO. Why? Because this is what Chris Grady said this morning as well. Well, the US, they have other things in focus as well, and this is where European nations, and this is what we discuss with them, how do we strengthen, how do we redress the military imbalance in order to have much more freedom of maneuver to that.
Great. Thank you, Admiral Blajan. For much of Washington, I think the assessment is, the EU doesn't do defense. That's NATO's job. But here we see you. You're in uniform. You're the Director General of the EU Military Staff, formerly held NATO positions. What has been the EU's role in this crisis from a military perspective over the last year?
Well, thank you, Max, and very happy to be back in the same room I was about 2 years ago. First of all, let me just, what's the military? You have asked the question, are we some kind of aliens in the EU institutions? I mean, we were. We started, we built the EU carefully removing the defense and military chromosome from the DNA because of the context of post-World War II. So when we started again to think about defending our strategic interest, that was a bit more than 20 years ago. At one time, this time, NATO had half a century of existence, so I can imagine that was questioning the established defense order in Europe. Since there, the serious discussion started, I would say 5 years ago, with some bottom-up initiatives on, European Defence Fund, the comprehensive annual report on defense, and so on. I will spare all the acronyms. We are world champion for that. But what we have thought at this time was to put some initiatives to consolidate the European defense pillar, and which is good for Europe, is good for NATO. And I will revert a little bit on EU-NATO relationship. So we did that at that time, and we ramped up also the EU military staff that I have the honor to command. In that capacity, for example, regarding Ukraine, I'm the guy managing the use of the European Peace Facility, that's funding mechanism, common cost mechanism, to deliver military assistance to Ukraine. And we decided that from within the 36 first hours of the war, which was, I mean, you couldn't bet on this reaction from EU at this time. To give you a figure, I've managed so far more than 8 billion euros of requests from member states to be reimbursed through that mechanism. Also, we created 4 years ago the embryo of the EU military headquarters in Brussels, and that's within that capacity. I'm also, as I'm dual-hatted, I'm also commanding that, and that's within that capacity that I'm the mission commander of all the EU military missions, including the newly established EU military assistance mission for Ukraine, launched on the 15th of November, and at the end of this month we will have trained more than 16,000 Ukrainian soldiers in that context. So it's, and we do that in full coordination with our partners. I'm liaising on a daily basis with Lieutenant General Aguto from the US Army. He's leading the coordination center in Wiesbaden in support of Ukraine. So that means also the cooperation is really increasing. Let me touch a point on from where we have been 5 years ago, trying to ramp up the capabilities, and with only at this time a light view on the industry, but ramping up the capabilities. It has been accelerated by a Ukrainian context. And then we have to ramp up the European industry to be able to enter a war economy. To do that, we need to offer a business model that is suitable for the industry. That means offer a critical mass of orders to them, and we can do that only if we enter the joint procurement sphere. Give you an example. 80% of procurement in the 27 member states of the EU are national, so they are not doing anything on 80% of what they are acquiring with anyone else. If you take a list of some key big equipments in the US, I'm talking about destroyers, submarines, fighters, transport, artillery, tank, you have a rough number of 30. In the EU, it's 187 different equipment for the same list. So that means it's not a good business model. We really have to enter that. And we have also to fill the gap before taking seriously about increasing our defense capabilities, to fill the gap from the peace dividend. We need, in the next 2 years, to top up our defense capabilities by 70 billion euros before thinking about increasing really our defense capabilities and being a relevant European defense pillar. So I'll stop there for the industry. Just a quick word on EU-NATO cooperation, because when you talk about development of industry, development of capabilities, you quickly enter the debate about some kind of competition where it's a false debate, really, and that's my mantra. There cannot be any competition. First, because what we do is also serving NATO, because as it has been said, and once again, congratulations to Finland, very happy that they joined officially yesterday, and Sweden will follow the sooner the better. That means 23 member states out of 27 will be member of NATO as well. And we cannot imagine that one day when they are at the NATO Military Committee, they say something, and the day after at the EU Military Committee, they say the reverse thing. So it's all the same single set of forces. So we need to really to kill that debate. And I think the first lessons of Ukraine has been the complementarity of both organizations. In that vein also, we don't talk too much about it, but the position of Denmark. Denmark has decided to give up the posture of the opt-out. You know, they decided not to be part of the common security and defense policy of the EU because they were fearing this kind of NATO and EU competition. No, they have decided in the context of the war against Ukraine to give up that posture, to be a full member of this CSDP, and to be at the table of decisions. So, yeah, I think, I mean, we can debate forever on that, but I think for me, it's 100% sure there is no competition because it's simply not possible. So, two or three more elements, matter of mindset. So, we'll have to learn our lessons from Ukraine. It has been already commented by Admiral Grady this morning, but there are two areas where we need really to work is the logistic and the military mobility within all territories. You know, as a former SACEUR said, it's easier for an illegal migrant arriving in Europe to cross over Europe than for an European or ally soldier with his equipment. So we need to fix that. And the war in Ukraine has been a live exercise of that. And we see the limitations we have. And the C2, command and control, not only in the capacities, the technical capacity themselves, but in the mindset as well. There is, for me, one lesson learned of how also Ukraine succeeded in front of Russia, beyond our support and so on, where they have got rid of their old USSR C2 mindset, very centralized. Russia is still on a very centralized C2 mindset. That means the boss gives the order and no one has the ability to adapt on the ground to the situation. The Ukrainians, they have decentralized to the maximum extent their C2, and that explains a lot of what they are doing. Two other things, we have to ask ourselves, what's next? So we have to make sure that Russia is not winning that war. We have to make sure that Ukraine is winning the peace. What does that mean? It has been commented this morning, so I will not go back on the definition what peace will look like. But we have to think beyond what's left for Russia. Mm-hmm. What do we want Russia to be in our discussion, in our equation in the future, especially in regard to our discussion with China. You know, it has been said, it's not from me, but I like the formula, Russia is a hurricane, China is the climate change. And so we need to really look at the parameters of this equation. And that addresses two other things, partnership. I mean, we are being focused on Ukraine, but what about the rest of the world? And for EU, especially the strategic area of Africa is of most interest. When you see how most of the African countries have reacted to the resolutions at the UN General Assemblies, either being absent because coffee was a bit too long, or abstaining, even those very supported by us, we have to hear the new message they are sending us. We have to change our discussion. We are not, you know, someone that you can teach how to do things. We want to be partners. You are not the unique model. You have to acknowledge that we can have a balanced approach and that your enemies are not necessarily our enemies. And so we need to listen to that and to adjust our posture, including in the defense and security support. And lastly, that also, it has been touched, the enlargement of the EU, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Balkan states, and others. It's a change of paradigm. We have enlarged EU roughly today on sharing economical principles and values. Today, we are enlarging EU, or we have the intent to do so, on security basis, to make the whole Europe territory more secure. That's a change of paradigm. Ukraine will be an EU member sooner than expected, I think, because in some way we will think that we will owe them, even if we will check all the conditions, but they are working really on the issue. So change of paradigm, we'll need a new treaty, I think, and we'll need to review our decision-making process. We are too slow. 27, I will be very diplomatic in saying it's a challenge to reach consensus. I think when we reach 35, we cannot work like that. Mm-hmm. And then my final word would be, how do we secure our change of mindset? We were herbivorous. We didn't become carnivorous, but at least I think EU has an omnivorous balanced diet today regarding defense and security.
Thank you, Admiral. Heather, I want to go to you, but let me just ask General Badia maybe to react to the EU's now doing quite a bit in the defense space. There's been a lot of concern here in Washington of duplication with NATO. As you know, from your vantage point, are you concerned about duplication, or do you see the roles as complementary?
No, because it's in your daily work, you see it's a matter of fact what you have. I give you a personal example. I was the planning director of the German Armed Forces, and a lot of the European nations coping with the same problem. I had to cope with 3 planning processes. I had a national one, I had an EU one, and I have a NATO one. It's still like that. Okay? And this is what you will see over time, that everybody comes to the conclusion we should strive to have one. And it's the NATO one. Okay? Because if you look across, it's a whole of government approach. You have instruments of power. EU has more because NATO is it's a political but military alliance, so there's the military instrument of power, and this is the one we use primarily. But of course, there are certain things where you need to have certain, like command and control, where you have certain capabilities installed, but overall, and that's what Javier just said, it's a single set of forces. This is what you have to use, and really what it is at the end of the day, and this is what we see in the daily work, what we do have, it's really harmonization, standardization, and interoperability in order to really to harmonize what we have and use it to a better extent. So from my point of view, with the contacts we have, with all the corporations we do have, cooperation is the way forward, and there's only one way forward, and it's a common one.
Mm-hmm. Great. Heather, to you, this has been, I think, the last year and a half when it comes to America's involvement in European security, sort of a wake-up call for the important role that the U.S. plays. And how would you sort of assess the U.S. role in European security, and what have you seen sort of over the last year?
Well, Max, thank you. It is great to be back here at CSIS in a very different role, so thank you so much. So, I mean, I want to sort of pull a little bit on both the General and the Admiral's comments. I would completely agree. Of course, we know the formula that it's will plus capabilities, but I'm going to add those capabilities have to match the agreed end state in Ukraine, and we do not have an agreed end state. So the capabilities, it's unclear to me, are we doing enough? Is that sufficient? And I agree. The NATO summit in Madrid really was substantial. Obviously, both for Sweden and Finland, I think we do have to just take this historic moment and say, wow, yesterday was an amazing day where we now have a NATO ally that, again, this, for me, the strategic commanding heights is the Arctic, a really huge issue there. But the challenge we're going to have as we head towards the Vilnius summit is thinking about forward defense, because we are now, and we hope that Ukraine's counteroffensive is completely successful, but if it is not, or if it is unclear that we have a prolonged stalemate, a prolonged attritional war, what does that mean for the eastern flank? does that mean we need more capabilities? And as Madrid noted, the shift from NATO brigades to NATO battalions, these multinational battalions, we're struggling to build to those battalions in a quick way. So we have an enormous amount of work to do. I would say, as I look at the Ukraine war, this is the ultimate laboratory for us, for U.S. equipment, for allied equipment against Russia and increasingly Iran's military capabilities. We see the role of drones. We see, in some ways, this is a private sector war. The commercial applications, the fact that the Ukrainians are jerry-rigging commercially available technology that's having important effect. The fact that the Ukraine episodically, unfortunately, relied on Starlink to basically allow it. This is a new dimension that I don't think we are quite capturing, and how much commercial applications, particularly technology, is going to play. If you were to ask me what are the European gaps, the same gaps that we've had for over a decade plus. This is, I think, the challenge for all of us. It's the frustrating conversation of enablers, ISR, logistics. We've talked about PESCO and the military mobilization, so we all know what the needs are. It's the speed of how we get to move these issues forward. I do have to commend the Admiral, the EU, the European Peace Facility. The rapid deployment and replenishment has been important. This decision to go to ammunition, a shared purchase, but we still know that's hitting snags now. Do we procure it globally? Do we only procure it within Europe? This speaks to the commonality of no one has the industrial base that's ready for this, not only to supply Ukraine for the long term, if that is in fact the political will to do so, but to replenish all the stocks, particularly along NATO's eastern flank. I see this as the opportunity to massively modernize NATO members along the eastern flank. But here's the challenge, and I think this is the Polish acquisition of Korean tanks and howitzers is now the point where we are. The production problem is going to be where allies are going to look for any supplier that can provide the capabilities that they need. And that brings a new challenge for NATO interoperability, because we're going to be now incorporating a lot of equipment that needs to be NATO certified and integrated. So, we've got, I think, incredible momentum. But what I worry about is after the initial days, and I'll close by just, the Zeitenwende moment, as Chancellor Scholz made that historic speech on February the 28th, some of that urgency is draining. They're not coming. Ukraine held them. Maybe this will take us a year to spend $100 billion in a very important defense fund, and I don't want to criticize a very important defense fund, but nothing has been spent on that, and that funding will go to cover a lost decade. Where are the new events? And as I'm looking ahead, even to the next summit after Vilnius, which will be the Washington summit here next year, where we will all look at how the Wales commitment has been met or has not been met. And tragically, I put a little fault on the US. We made this is the line, this is how we judge how an ally is committed to NATO. I think it's a terrible measurement, but that's the one we went with. That's going to be a very powerful list. The 20%, the investment, that's a great metric, and most of our allies have met that. The 2%, all things being equal, and everyone's GDP being equal, that's going to be a terrible statistic, and that's what most of the American people are going to be judging that. So huge opportunities and challenges, but I think we need to be very clear-eyed at the challenges ahead. We need that political leadership, and we need that urgency, not so much statements and communiques, but urgency to implement. So I'll toss it back over to you,
Thanks,
Max.
Heather, and I think you hit on a number of important themes. I'm going to pick out one of them where the capability gaps that have long been pointed to, the enablers, but it strikes me that one of the things the war in Ukraine has also demonstrated is that there's a capability gap in mass in our stockpiles of ammunitions. This is something CSIS has done a lot of work on. And General, I'm curious from the NATO Allied Command transformation perspective. So part of your role is to look around the corner. How do we balance the need to sort of replenish stocks, to buy the basics of ammunition and tanks, with also the need to learn the lessons of what we're seeing in Ukraine, as Heather mentioned, of the use of drones and other new technologies that are really critical for warfare. How do we make that balance between modernization into the future and then just replenishing our empty bins?
Allow me, before I get to the point, just one comment, a very personal one. There will be no end state anymore. You know, when we've been to General Staff College and all those issues, they will always be taught the end state. We never got one, but we always were striving for an end state. And nowadays, if you look at it, you will have conditions that need to be met to do something. Okay, you'll see it in the Ukraine, you see it everywhere. But an end, to define a real end state and to work for that, I don't see that anymore. Just my very personal comment with all the experience I do have on that one. How do we balance? And this is what my headquarters is doing most and foremost, because as I explained to you, and I don't want to get in too much details, but we are responsible for the NATO defense planning process. And this is where we do, through a sophisticated arena of studies and everything, this is how we try to predict in the future what's warfare in the future, 2030, 2040, digitalization of the battlefield, long-range weapons, all those issues, and what Admiral Grady alluded to this morning, we do as well. And with that, now we have 31 nations, we assign capability targets to the nations. We assign quantitative targets and qualitative targets. Okay? And if you look into that, and now it gets really sophisticated, because if you look at it, it's not only the 3 C's, it's cash, capabilities and contribution, and the 2% and the 20%. You also have to look which nations are providing what in order to really get the right mix of capabilities. And just to make it a bit more complicated for you, okay, right now there are only 4 nations who still apply to all the 68 qualitative targets we are giving. That's the US, that's Germany, that's France, and that's Great Britain. 4 out of 31, and those 4 making up 60% of the capabilities overall NATO needs in order to defend. So, and then you see how sophisticated it gets when you assign those capability targets. But with that, this is capabilities overall. But in sustainment and enablement, everybody needs to do that. The problem we are seeing, especially when we look towards Ukraine, because in the past, logistics was always a national issue. And this is why we are having the problems we are having, because you did not have to follow the real targets. This is what we are changing right now. What you're also changing right now is, you will see in about 4 weeks' time, when the regional plans designed by SHAPE, so our sister headquarters down in Mons, when they will present the regional plans, then it will be clear what's needed in order to defend if something happens right now. So they're coming up with that. What we do the first time is, because in the past we always looked into the future, and the NATO defense planning process was just looking at the future and saying what capabilities are out there we need in 10 or 15 years. Now you have it from today out. So we're combining what's needed today with what's needed in the future. This is all new quality in order to balance that. So, as I said, a lot of things have changed since the war in the Ukraine started, and with that we're really going forward with a completely new quality in the way we plan. And at the end of the day, as I said before, planning is nice, NATO is nations have to adhere to that, and nations have to bring the capabilities.
Admiral Blajan, maybe to pick up on the point that you made and Heather made and has also been made about the variety of systems, the challenges of interoperability. It strikes me one of the things that we've also learned from Ukraine is the difficulty of incorporating all these different systems that the Ukrainians are receiving, and the maintenance tails, and now we're sort of, everyone who follows the war in Ukraine has now become sort of familiar with the challenge that it can be to operate with all these different types of equipment. It strikes me one of the things that the EU is now starting to do with the joint ammunition agreement, which hopefully will be finalized and get off the ground from the EU, where the EU is collectively going to buy ammunition, is that this opens the door for the EU to help contribute to countries hitting NATO capability requirements, and also try to streamline some of the, you mentioned all the 27 different Pentagons within the EU, maybe helping coordinate them and to start buying the same things so they can hit NATO capability targets.
Yeah, I think that's really the challenge of the joint procurement. First, in a lot of member states, there is no doubt that the interoperability interoperability process is driven by NATO. I mean, we have been using NATO standards for forever. The difference is for those who were former USSR, part of Warsaw Pact, then they had a lot of old USSR era or old Soviet era weapon system. And so the challenge will be how we also use that context to modernize and to have, and that will go necessarily to the same standards. So I think that would go necessarily to the interoperability without also cheating too much on how we use that to really provide what Ukraine needs, and not with the kind of concept that we use that money to replace what has been given with other standards. In other way, the European Peace Facility, what I'm doing to render eligible an equipment, there are several conditions. Need to match priority one list provided by us officially by Ukraine, needs to be delivered at the speed of relevance. Our framework is 6 weeks, and need to be stock value, not replacement value. Otherwise, it would not be fair. I'll give you an example. When we started, and Poland has given 250 battle tanks, the first which were given were T-72, old pieces, €500 million piece, not that much. If we were taking in consideration the replacement caused by Leopard, for instance, it would not be the same. So we have to balance between the modernization, which drives to standardization and interoperability, to helping as much as we can Ukraine without with having the best value for the money we are putting there. So, but I think that will naturally go there. And the discussion we have with the Ukrainian, I was in Kyiv for the EU-Ukraine summit, is there, which is very good. They are looking at the future. So they are talking about modernization, about having an armed forces which will be within the new standards. And the standards they are talking about are the NATO standards, obviously.
Okay. And Heather, maybe to pick up on a point you also made about spending. There's been talk about the Vilnius summit of maybe there should be a new defense spending target where we should go from 2% to 3%. I think it's clear that everyone agrees that it would be great. We will, all want European countries to start spending more on defense and get their military forces back up to speed. But what do you think about the concept of setting a new numerical target for spending perhaps in 2034?
Well, if I wasn't excited about the 2%, I'm not sure I'm too excited about the 3%. And it's again, it gets back to what you're investing in. You can spend 3%, as we and latest figures, Greece, the Greek government does as well. But it's what you spend it on that counts. We backed ourselves into something that's a numerical target that I think is becoming increasingly weaponized as a way to say, allies aren't worth it. So, we have to be extremely careful. I find it interesting, though, that as we think about the replacement for Secretary General Stoltenberg, that, the candidate has to be from a 2%, that's your commitment. So it's just interesting to me how this conversation manifests. If I can just pull a couple of thoughts from this really interesting conversation. This is worth a seminar and a conference, and I don't want to belabor it, but I just want to put a stake on it maybe for a future idea, Max. This question about end state is huge, because what you just said, and I completely agree with what you said, then how in the world do military leaders know what capabilities they need if they never have the end state? How do you tell a population this is what we are achieving in the time frame? That to me is where we need a conversation about end state goals, and this is where my concern, just very focused on the war in Ukraine. If we are not clear on what victory or failure looks like, how in the world does General Cavoli know of what capabilities he requires to achieve that end state? But I completely agree with what you say. I just think it's something we need to think about. I think because the last 20 years, Afghanistan and Iraq, we had no end state. And in some ways, we have to think, I think, with a greater clarity, particularly what our populations will support. But I'm going to get off that topic right now. Two other quick thoughts.
Real quickly,
yeah.
Did you want to respond?
Well, I don't want to get this in debate. We've got to talk about credibility and capabilities.
We have a new seminar here. Just give you a thought, because it has to develop in a much more sophisticated world. And what I said before, at least from my observation, in the old world, there was a military instrument of power and it was black and white. So if there was something, military was sent. Now you have a lot of instruments of power. Military instrument of power is one. And I would comment and say the end state is something very political. And this is where it's hard to get. Nevertheless, General Cavoli, or we as military leaders, we have a very, very good feel for what it takes to win. Because everything is at the end, it's threat-informed, capability-based. And I give you just one quick example, okay? For us, it is, I would say, as important or maybe not so important what the lessons learned out of Ukraine from our point of view. For me, as a strategic planner, it's even much more interesting what the Russian lessons learned out of the Ukraine war, because this will be the threat we are facing in 10 to 20 years. And this is what I have to counter. And this is what we have to plan for. I'm not so worried that we from a military side of the house, we would not be prepared. This is what we are here for, and that's what we get paid for.
You make me feel so much better, and you could not be more right. What we actually have to be thinking about now is Russian reconstitution, and that in addition to this. So this is a parallel process. Just two very quick comments. Admiral, when you're talking about the European pillar of NATO and pulling on the general's comments about regional planning, for so long, how long has it been the taboo of NATO regionalization? You could not say it. But I think it is absolutely a natural evolution. And we just saw it in the announcement the other week with the Nordic countries using their aircraft. That is smart. That is exactly what we should do. But we have to have now, I think, a more conscientious approach. I'm not saying going back to the Cold War regional commands. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about a regionalization where all NATO members, there's a circulatory process to it, but we have a greater concentration, whether that's north, south, or the east. And I think this is something that we need to unpack a little bit. My final comment is on sustainability. I think we are not having a passing grade, in my view, and I love the pushback from the audience or the panelists about sustainability of existing equipment that we are providing to Ukraine. Some of that is by choice, by not allowing contractors and others to be able to facilitate. We're seeing the new center in Romania, a regional, this is important in Poland as well. But this is logistics, this is sustainability. We're seeing how this equipment wears. How do we have to manage that in the field? I think, again, this is a huge area of learning. And your point, Admiral, about are we going to keep sort of with the Soviet era equipment? Are we going to keep that because of cost and speed? Or are we going to modernize NATO's eastern flank? I would argue we have to push to modernization because that flank is going to have to be thickened. If we believe that Russia will reconstitute, if we believe this regime will at this over and over again, we're talking about a different. So this is where the long-term costs really do have to come in. But I appreciate that, the near term has to be addressed, and the funding is limited.
I think that's a great point, and I'm going to go to one of the questions from the audience, which was also a question I had, so it works both ways. But Admiral Blajan, you had mentioned that China is climate change, Russia is a hurricane. As a Floridian, the problem with hurricanes is they keep coming back, and I wonder now, as Heather's point about modernizing the eastern flank, it strikes me as a requirement because if you're giving away all the Soviet equipment, you have to modernize. NATO's focused on conventional warfare is back in Europe and the threat is conventional. However, and I ask this from an EU perspective, it strikes me that, especially as Washington has pivoted to, we're focused on Russia and China, but not so much on the Middle East anymore, not so much on North Africa, not so much on Europe's neighborhood, that the out-of-area operations and other interventions that we had been planning for the last 20 years, actually, Europe still may need to be doing those. And I'm curious, how do you balance the need to focus on the hurricane with other urgent challenges that may emerge in your periphery?
Well, the interesting thing in the context of the war against Ukraine that we could have seen the temptation of most of the EU member states to focus only on their immediate neighborhood, saying, okay, the threat is there, so rest is not that much important, and then we refocus there. It's not happening. It's not happening, and we have all those which are feeling the immediate danger from Russia, Baltic states, Poland, and so on. They are telling us also, well, we should not underestimate what's happening in the global south. I'm not sure I like very much that wording, but in other strategic area of interest, including those concerned by fighting against terrorism. We are in not a very comfortable position there because things are moving, but the focus is still very much there around the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, Sahel, up to the Gulf of Guinea. That's really an area where we do not want to give up things. And the challenge with this use of the European Peace Facility, which is exploding towards focus on Ukraine, is that the member states are remembering us where it's a global instrument. So we cannot spend everything for Ukraine. And if we do not have enough money to do that, we have to top up the instrument in order to preserve the global dimension of this instrument. And I think it's wise to do that.
Great. I'm going to take some of the questions from the audience, and then we'll maybe do lightning rounds and go through the panelists. There's a question about, from Byron, how is NATO viewing the red line in regards to cyber attacks and potentially invoking Article 5? This, I think, is a real concern for both NATO and the EU and the potential threats to European infrastructure. So General Video, maybe.
Yeah, there are strategic papers out there on how we view cyber, how we view cyber attacks. We are working in 5 domains: it's air, land, and sea, and then it's space and cyber. With space and cyber, it's different to the 3, more military-driven domains, because space and cyber is very much driven by civil side as well, especially look at the European side. And what we are working on, there are clear statements out there. There is a clear view out there that there could be Article 5 could be invoked, but at the same time, and we all know that, and that's not a secret, defining what would be a clear attack, how would you do that? This is really hard. And I just compare it also to space. If you see, the space treaty is from 1966, and nothing else has been basically could be agreed on later, how you use of space, then peaceful use of space, and it's the same on cyber. So if you compare those two, it's pretty hard right now. And what you really need to agree to, and this is what we're working to, and what we also see is you need a code of conduct. Because if you don't have the code of conduct, then where is your red line? And this is, from a military point of view, this is, again, it comes down to deterrence, and this is what we are working on, this is what we are needing. But right now, we will come to decisions if something happens, but it's pretty hard to do that, and we need to do better on that one.
If I can add something on that, because we have Article 5, we have the pendant in EU 42.7. I would say there are 2 things. First is the attribution. How can we give the evidence of the attribution? And usually in this hybrid domain, they carefully avoid to be clearly 100% sure of attribution. I take the example of the Nord Stream gasoduct. Who is behind it? Some people are saying, well, it cannot be the Russians or the US. The facts are just saying it has been done by professionals, and they make carefully sure they were not letting any evidence that would attribute to it. So, open question, I think we'll never have the answer to that. So the attribution is really important there, and that's all the context of the hybrid warfare. And then the answer. neither Article 5 nor 42.7 are triggering a military response. They are just making sure that one member state or one allied country is attacked and invoking that article, which needs to be endorsed by all the community, that everyone is considered to be attacked. What will be the nature of the answer or the response is another story.
Heather,
our understanding of when a cyber attack hits a NATO member, whether that was in 2007 in Estonia, the Bronze Night incident, or in 2022 with the, it was more hacktivists and Russian cyber criminals potentially in colonial pipelines, we manage it bilaterally. There isn't a desire to bring a NATO issue into it. Now, again, that's history. I think the question would be if you'd really have a crippling cyber attack against energy, nuclear power plants, wiping out, doesn't even have to be cyber, let's say tapping the transatlantic undersea cables that would cut all communications there. Is that an Article 5? So I think there's a level of severity, civilian issue, harms away, but I think, quite frankly, allies will manage it bilaterally in normal course.
And that's what it is right now, because when it comes to cyber, NATO's role is a coordinating role and raising awareness. That's what it is. But when it comes to capabilities, all the cyber capabilities, be it defensive or offensive, rest with the nations.
Admiral, we have a question from you from Greg Saunders. Looking at the 155 potential procurement, could that be applied to other areas, other portfolios, other weapon systems? And if so, which weapon systems?
Yeah. Well, there are two things. On 155, it's an urgent measure, urgent procedure that we want the European Defence Agency to take care of. But it's in parallel with a lot of other joint procurement projects we have put. And by the way, we have also added missiles in that urgent. So it's urgent for recompleting our stocks and also delivering it to Ukraine, because that's part of also their modernization. We're talking about Soviet era. They have a lot of 152 millimeter calibers, but there is no more ammunition, and very few people are able to produce them. They are not able, so they are already shifting to a standard. That's the reason why they are focusing on 155. But yes, the joint procurement adventure, or joint venture, I would say, is really focused on everything that the member states are thinking they need to build the proper army of the future in the European pillar.
It really is sort of a new era that the EU is buying ammunition. General, there's I guess for all panelists, there's a question about whether Ukraine will ever be a part of NATO. Also another question about Sweden-Turkey stalemate and whether there'll be a breakthrough there. Are we going to get to 32, 33? I think everyone's extremely excited about Finland. The Swedes are still waiting at the door. What about Ukraine? What would need to happen for Ukraine to become a member?
Okay. I start with Sweden. I'm absolutely convinced rather earlier than later they will join, and as we know what are the discussions are behind it, and I think we will overcome this at the end of the day. And this is from a NATO perspective and from a military perspective, it's always the cohesion of the alliance. You have to be very careful to send the right messages, because it's also a point of deterrence, number one. Number two, when it comes to Ukraine, this is a very political. Of course, Chris Padilla has a view to that, and this is what has been discussed this morning already. Okay, if a country is at war and what we see there, and then it's a European country, and that's what we had. Then looking towards EU and looking towards NATO, I think it's a clear way forward where this discussion needs to go.
Well, it's touching also the EU enlargement. I mean, those are the same principles. So about Ukraine, I have no doubt that Ukraine will become an EU full member. I cannot put a date on it, but I would bet it would happen sooner than expected. It's conditions-based, But I think there will be, and that's a personal view, I'm not expressing any official, I think there will be a kind of feeling that we owe them something. I mean, I'm putting myself in the context where peace or kind of victory will be in their hands, and we will owe them some things, and also because they are defending our values, common values, and because also where they are defending the next EU borders and the next NATO borders in some way. So I think they'll be part of it, but what I can tell you is that when I was in Kyiv for the EU-Ukraine summit, with President Zelensky, we discussed during 6 hours, 1 hour on the war, 5 hours of the accession. So that means they are doing their homework. They are changing the laws to fight against corruption and so on. So they are doing what's necessary to be a full member, ticking all the conditions that need to be met.
I mean, in many ways, Sweden and Finland demonstrated with speed you can enter NATO. There's no need for a membership action plan. There's no need for, in some ways, artificiality, other than obviously it's a reform process. So in some ways that demonstrated it can be done quickly at speed. Ultimately, in my view, as we talk about future security guarantees for Ukraine, there is only one security guarantee, and that would be its membership in NATO. And if we think about the cost of providing Ukraine the long-term defensive capabilities that it needs, the so-called porcupine strategy, to be able to repel future Russian attacks, that's going to be very expensive. So if you think about the cost-benefit analysis, that's a different way of thinking about it. I believe what Vladimir Putin has done has now set Ukraine on an irreversible course towards NATO and the European Union. I would think potentially that NATO is a faster process than the EU, and we know historically, typically NATO has come first before EU membership. We have historical understanding. We have welcomed divided countries into NATO, and that was West Germany. So we have precedent here. It's very, very difficult to see it now, but at the end of this, we are going to have a Ukrainian military that's one of the most highly NATO interoperable and one of the highest performing militaries in Ukraine. In Europe, it will add value to the alliance. So there are lots of reasons to think about this in a broader perspective. I believe Moldova could be shifting its own thinking about its neutrality potentially. So there's going to be other things to think about. We still have a lot of unfinished business, of course, in the Western Balkans as well. So much work to be done.
If I can just add something on that. So we have to make clear it's not a beauty contest between NATO and the EU. It's a joint venture. And it's the interest of NATO to have as many of the allied nations being part of the EU and vice versa. So, I mean, maybe we'll reach the finish line at the same time. Yeah.
That applies to our Norwegian and British colleagues as well, I think. So we have just 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask a very open-ended question for all three of you to answer in a very short amount of time. It's 2030. What has, and we look back on the last 7 years and say, man, Europe has really turned it around. What are the things that Europe has what are the steps Europe has taken to really strengthen itself defensively, and what are you hoping to see over the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. From a NATO perspective, it's really strengthening the European pillar of NATO, having military capabilities for the military instrument of power, that Europe, to a large extent, and always together with all allies, but to a large extent, can defend itself and make the world safer.
Yeah, for EU, I would say, first we have to secure everything we are doing today. I mean, we are doing a lot of progress. We have to make sure that when peace will be there, we are not coming back to our soft power. No, it's over, so we can ease the pressure. And we need to be much more agile, flexible, and a quick responder to any strategic surprise. We have seen last year it happened. It will happen again, I think.
Gosh, I hope we're not having the same conversation in 2030 that we're having here. I think for a European pillar of NATO to really come into its own, Europe has to have a bigger chunk of enablers. So they're doing this by themselves. It does not require the United States to be that framing logistics. And I think what we aren't talking about is, managing a two-theater construct and what elements of European military capabilities can be useful in the Indo-Pacific, and the U.S. needing to manage both theaters, not an either or. That's the challenge. Again, that's what Secretary General Stoltenberg and others are thinking about. How do you bring Asia-Pacific partners into supporting European security? How does Europe support greater Indo-Pacific security? That will be, I think, the continued challenge that we will have well into 2030.
With that, I want to thank you all. I want to thank you, General Admiral, for your service. I want to thank you for all the hard work that I know you all have been doing over the last year and a half to support Ukraine and strengthen European security. And for the EU-NATO cooperation that I think we see on stage that I think will hopefully be a taste of what we're going to see in the future. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. We'll take a quick coffee break, and then the third and final panel will be here.
just going to start at 30 seconds. Is that okay? I want to keep the time we've got on the schedule. Oh, are you live? Are you live? Oh.
I'm sure you're tweeting.
I don't tweet.
Neither do I.
I haven't.
By design.
Yeah. I haven't really gotten into social.
Welcome, everybody, to the final panel. And we've been building all day to the discussion we're about to have. We started off this morning with a discussion on the landscape in Europe. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've worked through issues related to the views coming from the Joint Staff with the Vice Chairman. Then we worked through issues related to European defense challenges and opportunities, including perspectives from some of our European general officers in France and Germany. And now we will conclude on what has become an interestingly lively topic, that is the state of the industrial base. And as someone who is a defense strategist, for even me to be weighing in on defense industrial base issues, now most people that are weighing in are not necessarily experts, which is what we have here, but it has become a topic du jour, probably partly based on the war in Ukraine, the stockpiles, but really appreciate folks. As a reminder to those that want to ask questions, Dr. Cook has an iPad on her, so those online, please ask your questions on the website, and she can pull those up. For those in the room, just use the QR code at your table, and she'll be able to pull those up as well. So with that, again, we will shift to the industrial base, and I will hand this over to the head of our Defense Industrial Initiatives Group, Dr. Cynthia Cook. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you, Seth. So we've had a very interesting day so far talking about many of the challenges that are being faced by Ukraine, by Europe. The goal of this panel is to move to the next step beyond understanding the challenge to implementing change and finding solutions. We have three outstanding panelists here, each of whom has had experience in very senior levels of the government and in very senior levels of industry. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce first on my left, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, the Honorable Deborah Rosenblum. And in addition, Ms. Rosenblum is currently performing the duties of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy, a very timely topic. She has also served in a variety of senior positions in the Department of Defense and spent 7 years as a vice president at the Cohen Group. To her left, I am very honored to welcome the Honorable Ellen Lord, who served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment in the previous administration, where she developed the very innovative Adaptive Acquisition Framework. Before working in the Pentagon, Ms. Lord was the Chief Executive Officer of Textron Systems, and she currently serves as a senior advisor to a wide variety of firms and institutions, and is also the Vice Chairman of the Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution Reform. So thank you for that. Finally, we have the Honorable Bill Lynn, who has had an extensive career in the national security space. While in government, Mr. Lynn served 2 presidents and 5 secretaries of defense, but we always like to point to people who began their careers at CSIS. So he was here a number of decades ago, before becoming the comptroller of the Department of Defense in '97 and the DepSecDef in 2009. And Mr. Lynn currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Leonardo DRS. So thank you all 3 for coming and participating in this discussion this afternoon. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about solutions to the industrial base challenges. So as Seth mentioned, we are taking audience questions, but I have started off with a couple of big picture questions that I'd like to get your perspective on. And the first one is a broad one, and I'd like to hear from all the panelists. What are the main opportunities for collaboration amongst transatlantic defense companies? What are the barriers, and how can they be overcome? How can we work together both in the US and with our European allies and partners to meet the demand?
So why don't I kick us off just with a few opening remarks with regard to that, and then turn it over to my fellow panelists. You know, there has always been collaboration as it relates to the defense industrial base between the US and our allies. I think what we're seeing now is that work being challenged to move in completely different ways and in different areas. And that's true both in terms of within NATO and within the NATO context, as well as outside of NATO, and we're seeing it in other areas like AUKUS. It's not just what's been front and center in terms of Ukraine. And what I'll do is let me hand it over to Ms. Lord before we get into what some of the challenges are.
Okay, thank you. So I believe constructive collaboration comes with focus. And we need to pick a few things and work on them. Typically, in some of these large forums like NATO and so forth, we talk at such a high level that we never actually get right down to it. So just a few things. We all know that technology is being imported from the commercial sector for national security needs. I would suggest that we need to take all of the artificial intelligence and machine learning out there and apply that to illuminating our supply chains. So we could collaborate with allies and partners to understand where we are sole sourced on certain critical items, where we have non-partners, non-allies supplying us, and we could pool that and start divvying up the work to get it done. But it has to be data-driven, and I think that's sometimes what we forget in these transatlantic or just global collaborations. Data, information, knowledge. We have to have a fact base. And, well, I have lots to say, but I'll stop there and pass it to Bill.
Thanks, Ellen. Let me step back maybe and talk about a framework to think about this. Is it, when you're talking about defense cooperation across the Atlantic, I think you're trying to achieve 4 objectives, and they're pretty straightforward. One is you're trying to increase capacity. You want more military formations, more mass, to be able to deal with threats, not just Russia, but out-of-area threats as well. You're also trying to, secondly, increase capability. You want the best technology for our forces, and the best way to get to source technology is going to be internationally. Use our allies. The U.S. has great technology, but not all of it. And I think so that cooperation can lead to capability. Third, and I think it's really been risen to the top now with Ukraine, is you want depth. You need to be able to have the munitions, precision guided or otherwise. You need to be able to replace equipment. So you're looking for a depth in that industrial base that, again, you can look to that cross-Atlantic cooperation. And then finally, you're looking for cost efficiency. How do you do things at a scale that's going to bring the costs down? There's, I think, only really 2 paths to get those 4 things. One is specialization. You can decide one country's going to build infantry fighting vehicles, a different one is going to do munitions, a different one still is going to do aircraft, or you could share it across a couple, but you don't really want 32 different aircraft, you don't want 32 different infantry fighting vehicles. And we're closer to that than we'd like to be. It's not 32, but there's a lot. And so that specialization is, I think, the most difficult politically because it's the most obvious way to efficiency in particular, but the political directives for both jobs and having the technology within your own base, the engineering base. All countries want some portion of that. So that's a significant barrier to specialization. The easier path, the other path, is collaboration.
is that, I mean, you're seeing it now, there's 2 European fighters being developed, and one of them is European-Japanese. But we've collaborated on the F-35. We've had, you know, different places where you at least move the production to different countries. But I think that it's how do we leverage those 2 paths, collaboration and specialization, to achieve the 4 goals of capability, capacity, depth, and efficiency. And I think everything else is just moving things around. There are barriers to achieving it. There are ways to overcome the barriers, but you can't ignore them.
One thing I would also add in listening to what has just been said is we're also in a period with our allies of getting back to basics. And what I mean by that is some of the assumptions that we had previously in terms of understanding what was in supplier bases, understanding what it would take to increase production and expand production. And just as we in the US are going through a real trying to understand what's there in the tiers below the primes, our allies are doing the same, and we're having a lot of success in terms of collaborating on just basically understanding what we have and where some of the obstacles are to improving that. And so it's a time where we are being forced to innovate to get things quickly into Ukraine, to get things more quickly into other places, but we're also taking a step or 2 back to say, okay, fundamentally, how are we doing? Where are there areas where we can better collaborate with industry to get rid of some of the obsolescence, to make some of those key investments in defense? And our allies are really looking to what the US is doing on this front and is working with us together in order to do that.
I would say one of the barriers to collaboration is an understanding within the global industrial base as to what the demand cycle is, or the demand signal. So we here in the US have the national security strategy flowed down to the national defense strategy, flowed down to defense planning guidance, but that's typically classified. And then it's somewhat unclear what government is saying we're going to buy and not buy. And then when we have the budget cycles of 1-year budgets, yet the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution cycle has to start way before that, it introduces a lot of churn. So if you own a business, whether it's a privately held company or a publicly held company, you need a clear demand signal over multiple years to allow you to invest your discretionary funds in capital, equipment, tooling, whatever it might be, to drive that capacity and capability. However, we in the US have gotten away from funding any surge capacity whatsoever. So even before Russia invaded the Ukraine, we had some challenges in terms of forward deploying all different types of systems and making trade-offs in what would be used. Now it's gotten even more difficult. So I go back to this focus, focus, focus. We need to pick a couple things and have a clear demand signal and get the contracts flowing. Doing research and engineering doesn't build capability and capacity. Putting contracts on the street, that builds capacity. And I think we need to start practicing collaboration with our partners and allies by putting those contracts out and perhaps pooling that demand signal, just like is done at NATO right now. Now, one of the barriers to this is a bit of confusion between what the EU's doing and what NATO's doing, and whether or not those two things are mutually supportive or not. And then we also don't always look to Australia who has a lot of capital and a lot of internal desire to build capacity and capability, but we tend to get a little hung up between our military and political side in terms of generating a demand signal that they can then address. So I think we need to be clear, and we need to have the intestinal fortitude, like we did in the last approach bill, of having some multi-years here. And we have to accept we're going to take away some of that future decision space in order to make it clear to business what is out there. And then there'll be investment, and then I think we can all work together.
How do we make sure that this inflection point is sustained? It's not going to help industry if it's just a 1 or 2 year, hey, we need lots of munitions, and they build up the capacity, and then in 5 years they have these plants around that aren't being used and that are increasing their costs and making it harder to compete for other contracts. How do we balance what we need now with this future where we may or may not need
I'll
a
jump in
surge?
with one thing and then hand it off. I say we have to realize in the defense industrial base that the government is not developing most of our technology these days, whether that be manufacturing technology or research and engineering, developing new things other than, yes, nuclear energy and hypersonic weapons, where it's low demand in terms of numbers, but highly difficult to do. And we have to figure out that we can build manufacturing facilities that are interchangeable in terms of what you put in them. And it's a design for manufacturability, a design for flexibility. So I think we need to think forward about how you design those facilities so that you can quickly change out end-of-arm tooling on equipment and think a little bit more broadly. Commercial industry has done this. We don't always do this in the defense industry.
So Deborah, what are your perspectives on that? How can you encourage or invest in industry so that they are building this innovation capacity versus building capacity for yesterday's weapons?
So, it's really a combination of two discrete areas. One is there is some of the foundational investments that we're making. In fact, the irony of this is not lost on us. When the Department of Defense put out a report the day that Russia invaded Ukraine on what we fundamentally need to be doing with our defense industrial base. And those are things with regards to onshoring, those are things with regards to working with allies and partners in areas where we have common purposes around rare earths, critical materials, things like that. But then it's also a matter of taking the big lessons learned that we're learning in real time with the Ukraine experience, and before that, with COVID, and trying to put things in place that have more systemic, long-lasting impacts. And Ellen, you had mentioned multi-year. That's a very good example of that. I think the feast and famine approach that we've taken historically to munitions or other key elements, in spades, we are, across the board, be it government, be it industry, understand that that is not an approach that is going to serve us well over the longer term. And so it's looking at the authorities we have and saying, how can we maximize some of these?
Just one detail there, because I can't help myself. There is so much urban legend around multi-years, because things are in statute, things are in policy, and then people believe that certain things are policy. And when I was in the building, again, just a soda pipe, a soda straw in terms of when I was there, I heard over and over again, oh, the Hill will not allow us to do multi-years. That is totally untrue. There is no aversion on the Hill to multi-years. It was a concern in the building going through the staffing process about that. And it's realistic, it's decision space. But part of what we have to do, I think, to contract effectively and work with others is understand what statutory authority we have, what policy authority we have, and how to put implementation guidance in place so that the individuals who are contracting and program managing and so forth understand the art of the possible.
To that point, we have found certainly over the past 2 years, there really has been bipartisan support on Congress for a lot of the things that we have come forward to ask in terms of greater flexibility, not just on the acquisition side, but fundamental investments that we're making in the defense industrial base. And so it's not presupposing, but it's just asking and explaining the logic.
But the key to multi-years is multi-year funding stability. In other words, you have to be able to predict the amount of money. As a former comptroller, if the budget goes down significantly in a year or over a couple of years, always the easiest thing to change is the production rate. You can't change the force structure overnight. You're not going to pay the troops less. You don't want readiness to go down. What can you do? You can buy fewer end items. There's an inefficiency in that, but otherwise it's very doable. And so if you put multi-years in place, you take away that flexibility. I think that's what Ellen's saying. So what you have to have is a world where you're not going to need that flexibility, where you're going to have a predictable budget to within at least some parameters. If you don't have that, it makes multi-years much, much harder.
And perhaps that is a demand signal to look a little bit more closely at what we have for requests for, FMS and DCS cases, and perhaps try to work those through NSC, State Department, Congress a little bit more quickly, because I don't believe often enough we're making the point that our economic security and our national security are incredibly intertwined. I mean, CSIS has done great studies, Cap Hicks did, on gray zone warfare and so forth. This has been going on for a while. So economic stability, in terms of having that predictability to be able to build the capacity, I think is really key.
So picking up on that stability point, senior leaders have gone on record, including Dr. LaPlante, Dr. Roper, Secretary Kendall, as saying that munitions have frequently been bill payers as services balance their budget. There's no single congressperson who says, no, don't cut munitions. And since they're so separable, you can cut 157 and make up a hole in another program. And then they don't get made up the next year. The next year, the same thing happens, and then the gap just increases. One of the things multi-years can do is sort of try to put a stop to that, at least in the short term, so that services don't use munitions to, they don't accept risk in munitions in favor of something else. Is that a way of addressing the munitions challenges that we're facing today? Are there other ways of doing this?
It's one way. I think I think what you're really highlighting is, I think we underappreciated the value of munition stocks. And so people thought this was a lower priority. When you're cutting the budget, you cut lower priority. I think it's really a realignment of the priorities. There is a cost to this. You're going to have to give, the top line probably isn't going up because of this.
No.
So you're going to have to give something else up, and you're going to have to put that surge capacity higher on your list than it has been in the past. I think that's one of the major impacts of Ukraine, is that we realized that we underappreciated the value of the stocks, of the surge capacity, and it isn't, well, nobody thought it was a free move, but people thought it was a lower priority item.
Well, for a while, we were thinking it was all from the sky or from the sea, right? And so munitions were a bit devalued. So I'd say another lens we need to have here as we think about future planning and programming and budgeting is that a lot of our major weapon systems are beginning to be bifurcated into hardware and software. And the hardware, a ship, an aircraft, and so forth, is becoming a little bit more the commodity, and it's the software that's being upgraded on a routine basis. So these systems are hardware enabled, but they're software defined. And perhaps we need to think a little bit more about munitions and guided weapons, where frankly, there's a lot of metal and so forth that goes in those that you can't get around it. So how can we sort of rethink our capability, if you will, through software and hardware, and begin to look at the type of fight we have. And we know there are a lot of different types.
I think the type of fight is key. I think we've been, I don't want to say trapped, we've been heavily influenced by a couple of paradigms that are changing. One is, and remember Desert Storm, what was it, 96 hours? And so we thought we just needed enough to take somebody down in 96 hours, which worked fine for that particular scenario. And then for the next 20 years, really, the scenario has been dominated by counterinsurgency, which requires a lot, but it's a different kind of requirement. It's very different than what we're seeing in Ukraine with a large-scale ground warfare over a longer period of time. And then we're kind of imagining in the Pacific, not quite the same fight, but the same kind of duration anyway. And that's changing your requirements from what we were thinking about from, kind of 90 to 2011, 2015. And we have to shift our industrial thinking as well as our strategic thinking to back that up.
And I think it's also maintaining, as you just articulated, the discipline. So we now have, the National Defense Strategy of 22, building very much on what was outlined in 18, with the singular focus on China, and then, of course, the acute threat we're facing right now with Russia. But it's for the building to maintain the discipline, that it's not enough just to have the strategy, but it's the capacity to execute on that strategy that needs to be developed. And I think that is something that we are absolutely seeing in the Ukraine crisis in terms of within DoD, is that those that focus on, okay, if we draw down X amount of stocks for the Ukrainians, what are the implications over what time period? What will that do when we think about China? What will that do when we think about our allies and partners and support that we provide to them from an extended deterrence perspective? And it's maintaining the discipline of having the resources and the capabilities aligned with the strategy.
So I think, Cynthia, there's another piece here that we haven't talked about yet that's really important. We are always going to be constrained in terms of what we can do in the U.S. from a manufacturing point of view. A much easier, faster lift, potentially, is to tackle those tough NSC, State Department, congressional issues in terms of technology release. Because we obviously have allies and partners that want to produce for a variety of reasons. And these are challenging questions in terms of what do we release and what do we not. Because obviously we do not want technology falling into adversaries' hands. However, we have a conundrum here because we have a finite capacity and we've got to figure out how to do it. I personally don't think there's enough focus on looking at ITAR and where we can move the needle. Again, a lot of discussion, not a whole lot of action because these are tough choices. But I think Ukraine has shown us that we have to face these issues and come up with something that's workable, both from a U.S. industry point of view. There are many companies that would love to sell to a variety of countries, and it's held up for a variety of reasons, most very good reasons, but it's held up. And we do not do the technology transfer to allow actual manufacturing indigenously in whatever these countries might be. I think it's time that we have to get the political side and the military side together and really talk about that so that we can rationalize it in a way that links budget to strategy. Because we only have so much budget, we have a big strategy, we need more focus, in my opinion, on our technology transfer policies.
And from the beginning, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And having the issues around exportability being dealt with up front and not later in the process where all of a sudden you're like, wish we'd thought about that before.
And it's a whole of government issue. So you've got to bring state, commerce, DOD, USTR, bring everybody to the table in an interagency way, which is, always challenging and can be a significant emotional event quite often. But, I think we need the leadership to push that through.
So I love this panel because not only are you asking each other questions that I have, but you're also raising questions that the audience has put in too. So one of the questions we've gotten has been on how can we fix ITAR? Do we need a top to bottom ITAR reform? Can we come up with like the adaptive acquisition framework for ITAR where there's different pathways? What's the innovation look like?
Solve world peace all at once. You know, it's got to be crawl, walk, run. Let's look at what the demand signal is right now in terms of really having the inventories for our O plans and being interoperable with allies and partners. And let's look at what the 5 top, weapon systems are. Let's go just work those. And so let's practice the behavior, have a use case, because I think often we talk in generalities that no one can wrap their brain around. And we need a use case to actually work it through.
Amen.
And the other point I would add on that is that not to do it in isolation, whether it be the use cases or when we're looking at, for the 99th time, the reform of FMS, but that it's part of that broader consideration of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve.
So start from the outcomes we want to see and use that to define the process or to shape the process.
Another really important point here, my learning being in government is, everything's a campaign. It takes everybody pulling the same direction. No one person can get anything done. So you have to fall in my opinion, on existing infrastructure to get these things done. So Bill LaPlante, in his role as our National Armaments Director, goes to the Council of National Armaments Directors twice a year in Brussels, works with NATO. He has the 5 powers with, Italy, Germany, UK, France, and ourselves. Use those existing bilats. Use ADAC and OSMAN with Australia to work these issues. Everyone at the action officer level is always looking for projects that have meaning today and lasting impact tomorrow.
That's right.
These are not ethereal issues. I think we need to tackle some things that we can get done.
But I think there are kind of 2 paths to ITAR reform. One is the one we usually pursue, which is we're going to make it faster, and the approvals are going to go faster, and the departments are going to coordinate better, and so on. And that'll get you incremental improvement, and every administration comes in and says they're going to do that and does some and not too much. I think the bigger question is we've set up a system where we've balanced in favor of caution. We are cautious about our technology transfer. We are cautious about who is going to get it. And we are cautious about the overall impact on regional conflicts. If you want to fundamentally change the system, you're probably going to have to change that balance of caution. I don't know whether the country wants to do that. I know, at State and Commerce almost surely do not. In any administration, it's not a political thing. But if you really want to take on ITAR reform, you're going to have to revisit that fundamental compromise that we've made as a nation and see are we happy? Because we have set up a system that is intended to be slow and cumbersome, and the result is there's no better advertisement for a foreign defense company to say it's ITAR free. That is, if you're that's the first thing you say in any competition, and it's enormously powerful. And but it's, as I say, I think it's really intentional within our political policy. This is the bargain that we've made with ourselves. If we want to have ITAR reform, revisit that bargain. Maybe we'll change it, maybe we won't. But just changing the cycle time of approvals isn't going to change much.
That's why it has to be top down. It has to be a force function. So you've got to get all the people who work it coming up. But there has to be the White House saying, this is an imperative for our national security. This is an imperative for our economic security. And SecState and SecDef, I want you to go look at it for the next 30 days kind of thing. And then the Hill has to want to do it as well, right?
Deborah, you have... more to add on this?
No, I agree completely with what you've both said. I mean, I do think that the situation in Ukraine is not providing use cases per se, but it is definitely forcing the system to relook some of those assumptions that we've had in the past of being much more cautious, much more concerned about where things ultimately, technologies are going to land in those areas. The degree to which that will be sustainable to lead to a fundamental reform or change in the policy, I think remains to be seen. But the system is being taxed right now.
It is.
But I think also what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine is how important commercial technology is, right? Whether it's streaming, satellite, video, or whether it's, hundreds, thousands of attritable drones where kind of volume has a quality all of its own. We're seeing that there are ways we can get this done if people put their minds to it. So it doesn't always have to be super classified what we're doing. And I think one of the challenges, John Hyten and I used to talk about this all the time, we are so overclassified that it is constraining us. Mm-hmm. And so that's another area. And there's a Venn diagram where ITAR comes with it. But this is something else we need to attack. And, who's the guru of that? Who's going to be the declassification czar? It's a little bit nebulous because that responsibility is spread across a lot of groups.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but I do think that particularly with the emphasis, apropos the topic of this panel, of allies and partners and collaboration, that there really is a mindset shift now to being like, okay, answer me as to why this is classified now, as opposed to the ingoing assumption being that it needs to be classified. There's still a ton of work to be done in that area, but it is a leadership down-driven imperative now.
Well, U.S. industry, the U.S. defense industrial base, is losing a lot of sales to other countries because we will only sell like 4 generations behind where we are now. And there's no clean mechanism or group or forum to systematically address that.
Yeah, we know that if there is demand for weapons, U.S. manufacturers are often the first choice for allies and partners. Not always, but often. But if they can't get our capabilities, it's not like they're not going to buy it. They're just going to find another purveyor. So it's not that we're limiting them in acquiring something. They're getting it, just not from us. So.
Absolutely. I'll tell you just a quick little vignette. Back when I was in industry, I was at a Mideastern air show, had a Mideastern customer who had been talking to us for like 2 years about a tactical UAS. I mean, we're not talking something huge here. And he finally said to me, Ellen, I'm going to go buy it from the Chinese because I can buy 10 times as many for what it would cost me to buy yours. And I know that at least 80% of them are going to crash pretty quickly, but at least I'll have something.
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion of ITAR and FMS suggests that the U.S. is developing the innovative capabilities and our allies and partners are waiting to acquire them. But they're being developed by allies and partners as well. Norway has developed the Naval Strike Missile. Australia has developed the E-7 Wedgetail Airborne Early Warning Aircraft. As innovation is coming from all corners of the world, how is the U.S. defense industry and the U.S. government postured to harness global innovation, and what roadblocks stand in the way?
One thing I want to add to your comment is it's not only innovation, but it is also looking hard at what allies can provide with regards to some of the critical materials, some of the foundational investments that we know we have to be making around rare earths, around batteries, around a whole host of things. So it's really changing that paradigm to being not just innovation at the end of the product, but what is it that we need to make sure that we have supplies of here in the United States, some of our closest allies, be it Canada, be it the UK, and others, to be able to take advantage of that.
I think it's going to be a challenge to get non-US critical cutting edge technology from other nations if there's not a quid pro quo in terms of we're not sharing some of the same. And that becomes a bit of a dilemma.
Yeah, I think one thing you do want to look at here, I think there has been progress. I do think the U.S. is far more open to international sourcing now than several decades ago. I think there's more progress to be made, and I mean the biggest inhibitor is always jobs, but that's overcomable because you can always produce it here. I mean, you don't have to invent it here to produce it here. And I sometimes look as an example there as we're behind them, but the automobile industry. I mean, if you go back to the early 80s, it was unpatriotic to drive a German, Japanese car. That's not the case anymore. I think it's not the case anymore because maybe out of date a couple of years, but I think the largest U.S. car, the largest export number of cars exported from the United States, BMW. Because they're building them all in the South. They're producing them globally, and so you get a great acceptance in this market because the jobs are here. And similarly in Europe, you can sell in Asia. So if you distribute the production across the international landscape, I think that breaks down a lot of the political barriers and inhibitions to buying things with a international nameplate on it. And I think defense can go down that same path.
I think that comes back to then what you're articulating about manufacturing and manufacturability here. And I know, Ellen, you were a little bit jaundiced in terms of whether we will become overnight a manufacturing.
That's right.
But I think that is one of the things that certainly coming out of COVID, but more broadly in terms of just our economy broadly, is the need to get back to that level of manufacturability. And, are we looking at what was there in the 50s? No. But we certainly are looking and aiming towards something that is far greater than what it was, say, 10 years ago. And with that, the workforce that needs to go with it.
So that, in my mind, opens up a whole nother area of discussion that was really illuminated by COVID, where we realized when we were getting counterfeit, PPE and advanced pharmaceutical ingredients that weren't what we thought they were and so forth, that we had slowly over time outsourced so much globally for good reason. We thought it was a resilient and robust system where you got the best of the best. But what we began to realize when we really looked at things and had to reshore or onshore things was that our regulatory environment had gotten to such a degree that we were driving things offshore because it was cost prohibitive to manufacture them here. So when we talk about building capability and capacity, I think we need to think about the regulatory environment as well. I mean, no one wants to overly pollute. Everybody wants to hire people and so forth, but we've got to be realistic about requirements. We've got to get back to really valuing the trades here in the United States. I think one of the worst things we ever did was make it, for whatever reason, not as honorable to be an electrician, a welder, a plumber, whatever it might be, a pipe fitter. And we've just, for lots of these different reasons, as well as taxation at local, state, and federal levels, we just drove our manufacturing economy offshore. And so we need to bring a lot of that back in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I would add to that, too, is getting away from the need for college education. For many of the individuals, and the automotive industry has done that very successfully, particularly down in South Carolina, where they have married up with technical schools, and there's a pipeline then for a job. And when we look at across the board the modernization that the Department of Defense is trying to get done writ large, be it on ships, be it nuclear modernization, we certainly touched a little bit on munitions. This is things where we're going to need craftsmen for the next 2 to 3 decades. And so if you can capture people much earlier on in high school and say, there's a career for you, a livelihood, is something that we as a government very much need to be focused on.
When I go out to industry, concerns about hiring are one of the #1 challenges that they face. And it's not necessarily that people don't want, touch labor type jobs. It's, sometimes they're in high cost of living places like, submarines and ships have to be built on the shore, and those are typically higher cost of living. So the U.S. will never compete with other nations in terms of having the lowest labor cost, and it will never compete with other nations in terms of having the laxest, pollution regime, environmental regime, and we don't want to compete on those. So how do we invest in new technologies to deal with, managing pollution? How do we make sure we have a robust labor force that's eager to support this sector? So I think these are some of the real challenges that the government can face.
Yeah. And I'm not a big government person, but I will say the use of Defense Production Act Title III money that Deborah oversees now to do some of those things is really critical. That's where it makes sense for government to step in, because for instance, the critical minerals, the issue is not so much getting them out of the ground or finding them, it's the fact that the processing of them has typically been very, very dirty, high polluting types of scenarios. And now some of that DPA Title III money is going towards cleaner versions of that. And that's again where we need to leverage technology for clean manufacturing.
We also have a different understanding of the necessity to onshore that than we did 10 years ago, and that is part of the call for the innovation in this area. So,
that's a huge collaboration opportunity when you look down the supply chain. We don't have to start with, F-35s. We can start with some of the building blocks where if you look at supply chains, they typically go 7, 8, 9 levels down. Everybody knows about 1, 2, and 3, but because of contract privity, you don't always know what's out there. Now there's AI, ML that can scrape that information and get down to the end item, and you can figure out where those opportunities are and where the volume is.
I think if you do that, you see that there are single points of, I don't want to call them single points of failure, but single points of success or single points of constraint. So there's no way we can identify those and develop alternative sources unless we can see where they are.
And we have the technology.
Yeah, and I think it's also a cultural shift. And we're seeing this now at the Department of Defense where, historically, we looked at some of the major acquisition programs as the responsibilities of the services. And so each service was dealing with a set of supply chain challenges or workforce challenges that in some ways it's shifting the mindset to say, what's being experienced isn't unique to the Air Force or unique to the Navy, but are there ways in which using, for instance, the DPA Title III monies, we can make major investments that will benefit across the department in the approach that we're trying to take, so we don't end up, inadvertently cannibalizing ourselves between various programs run by the different services.
I think that's being done. During COVID, we stood up the Industrial Business Council, where everybody sits around the table, and that's what vectored a lot of those.
Correct, and the Deputy Secretary right now is very focused on making sure that, one, we have much better supply chain illumination, but also that we are looking at these as defense industrial-based challenges writ large, and not just a challenge of any of the individual military services or departments.
Good. So we are getting a number of questions from our very well-informed audience, and they are so well-informed that they are raising questions right before you start talking about them yourselves. But we do have one focused on another way of working closely with allies and partners, and that's interchangeability. This is sort of the current term of art. 6 months ago it was interoperability. Now we're talking about interchangeability. What are the policies that the government can do to support interchangeability, and what would industry like to see in this area?
Why don't we start with industry?
Bill, how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, as always, what you want in industry is predictability. So you're looking for the government to figure out what it wants and tell you. I think with interchangeability, we haven't quite gotten there yet. I think it's a little bit more aspirational than it is concrete. I think it's the right way to go, and I understand the logic of it. But I think what we need to do then is to say, okay, concretely, what does that mean for the equipment that we want to buy? Where do we want industry to make investments? Yeah. Where can we get, frankly, cross-border collaboration where maybe you're making the same thing or compatible things on both sides of the Atlantic? But it's going to take some sort of government policy set. The industry is not going to be able to create this for the government. They're going to be able to respond to the government, but only if it's laid out in some multi-year fashion.
So I think this is a huge opportunity for collaboration, whether it be at the Council of National Armaments Directors or other places. What we're talking about are uniform standards, I think not just within the US, but with our allies and partners. Like 155s can't be used in everybody else's equipment. So what are those interface control documents? What are those key dimensional tolerances that if we standardize them, what are the minimum numbers? What are the minimum standards required to allow the same munitions or ammunition to be used in a variety of delivery systems owned by these countries?
You know, it's an interesting question, too, because we're seeing it in terms of interchangeability right now of necessity as it relates to Ukraine, where, you know, rushing various capabilities to the battlefield is really requiring, and there's some discrete examples of that. You touched a little bit on that with, you know, one of our foreign partners in terms of, you know, U.S. software, U.S. training added to a NATO country's, you know, capability that was added. And the question that is there, I think we're all seeing the benefit of that. The question is, will it have a lasting benefit so that it does translate into policy changes and changes that are meaningful? And I think the jury is still out on that because we're living this in a pilot phase, if you will, of necessity.
So how do we take this pilot phase and make sure that people understand the benefits of it and it becomes more instantiated into policy?
Well, typically, what you do is you work within the department and the interagency, and then you go to the Hill and find some staffers that are interested in this, and then you get Pathfinder projects written into the next NDAA, and you try to keep it going year after year until it becomes statute.
So crawl, walk, run.
Well, and I also think it's something that Ellen touched on a few minutes ago, and that's within the NATO context, within the national armaments directors, is saying as everyone in real time is digesting what's being done and the lessons learned, it's then coming back and saying, in a less emergency situation than what we're facing right now in Ukraine, look at what we've accomplished, look at how it worked. Is this something that we can take going forward within the NATO context?
Yeah, I think this interchangeability is a much lighter lift than ITAR restrictions, you know, being diminished. So if people want a quick win, this is one to go work, I would say.
But I think we shouldn't get overly focused on munitions. It happens that Ukraine, because of the circumstances, is really fighting alone, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And you're going to want to be able, so it's not just munitions, it's communications, it's command and control. It's how do we have that interchangeability across the functions of the force, not just munitions are particularly important right now with Ukraine, but it's not the only game.
You know, I'm totally with you on that, but you have to practice the behavior on something. So it'd be a great proof point to kind of get going.
Well, and I also think that given, you know, where the conflict is and the fact that, you know, expectations are not that it's going to end tomorrow. we're going to see the issue of interchangeability in other areas as well. I mean, just speculating here, but things like air defense, other things where there's a discrete requirement by the Ukrainians. I think we're going to see more and more of, let's look at that interchangeability.
And I think if we step back and, take the hypothesis that Russia invading Ukraine is a proxy for China going into Taiwan, well, let's not study the problem forever. I think we need to, show the world that we can learn quickly.
Can the current U.S. defense industrial base support the development of a combat credible force in both Europe and the Pacific? Do we have the capacity for that? How could it be bolstered? I mean, you mentioned the pacing threat.
Yeah. Well, in my mind, you have to have a clear strategy and then implementation guidance that says what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and what the funding looks like over a period of time. Industry will respond very quickly when contracts are let. But we have to pick winners, and we've got to get going, and we've got to realize that as incredibly important as the major primes are to us, there are a lot of other players out there who are very significant as well.
And I think the thing, too, is that it's not just in terms of looking at that with the ultimate high-end systems, but it's also saying, are some of the foundational investments being made, are they going to be able to benefit any future conflict that we may have? And so it's really, yes, absolutely being aware of what over the next 5 years may be required, but it's also saying, are we going to be in a better place fundamentally for the defense industrial base and the broader industrial base based on, walking and chewing gum at the same time?
I think you can see an example of that right now in the submarine industrial base with the recent AUKUS agreement. Right now, our submarine industrial base cannot quite produce 3 submarines a year. We want to produce 2 Virginia and 1 Columbia. We're a little short of that, and so the Virginia is going a little slower than we'd like. The aspiration is to increase that submarine industrial base, and with AUKUS adding a submarine in about 2030, we're going to have to. The way to do that is to push. We're not going to build another nuclear submarine yard.
No.
So we're going to have to get more capacity out of that yard, which means you're going to have to push work to suppliers. But if you do that, you can focus then the workforce at the yards to increasing the throughput. And that's indeed what the Navy and the yards are looking at right now, well in advance of that AUKUS requirement. So I think that's a place where if you have the desire and the need, you can drive an industrial capacity to the levels that we need to support the national strategy.
It's a really good point because Pillar 2 of AUKUS is going to be broader and has lots of applicability as well. And I think for the first time, we have incredible policy top cover with AUKUS and then INTIB below it, which is kind of a little bit of a hollow authority out there. Again, now we have the use cases with INTIB with Canada, Australia, UK, having some ITAR relief. Canada has a minuscule amount, but we've never really fleshed that out. So I think AUKUS is an incredible opportunity, and then with the Defense Strategic Review coming out the end of this month from Australia, it even gives more impetus.
Thoughts on AUKUS?
I agree completely. Well, certainly it is an opportunity for us, not only in terms of challenging our own industrial base, but those of the UK and Australia. And we've not talked a lot about the UK here today, and much of what we are seeing, experiencing, driving here in the United States, the UK is doing very similarly. And that is going to be a partnership, particularly as it relates to not just foundational investments, but also their view around CFIUS. We've not talked at all about sort of Chinese investment in the United States, in the UK, and other places where I think that there can be a strengthened partnership around that.
Well, I have all afternoon, but I think we have to draw this to a close. So with final remarks in the last 2 minutes, if you have, for the industry side, if you have one government policy you'd like to see change or evolve or improve to make a difference for the challenges we face today, and I won't put that on you, government side, so if you just have a closing remark you'd like to make.
Of course.
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about it. I think the most important thing for industry is predictability. I think it's the bargain that you make in the defense industrial base is the government pays a substantial part, but not all of your development costs. Restraining margins is the trade-off. But you have to know where you're investing, because these are long-term investments. So if the goal shifts year to year or every couple of years or even administration to administration, it's very, very difficult to make the kind of longer-term capacity and facility investments that are needed to deliver what the government wants. So the more predictability, the more assurance you can have that the investments you make are truly where the government is trying to take the security environment, that's, I think, is going to get you both the best technological answer and the most cost-efficient answers.
So predictability.
Predictability.
I think the largest opportunity is to operationalize AUKUS. We have, for the first time, policy alignment. We have the INTIB underneath of that. We have Australia, who's very willing. We have a great relationship with the UK. We share all kinds of nuclear information with them. So I don't think there's ever been a better platform, better top cover to go and get some use cases and start working it very quickly.
So we have AUKUS as a way of making
it's an enabler.
Springboard.
It's an enabler, absolutely.
So I think that, what I would say in concluding pieces was something that Ellen touched on a little bit earlier in this panel, and that's very much the fundamental nexus between economic security and national security, and we are fundamentally living that right now. And we would have, just coming out of COVID, period, because we saw many of the same issues and problems that we've had there, but it's been put on steroids now in terms of the crisis in Ukraine. And by linking them beyond just the defense industry production side, but it's also looking at where there are some fundamental adversary threats to our economy, particularly in terms of some adversarial capital investment and things like that. And so when we think about defense and national security, that we're actively bringing in the economic security piece as part of that dialogue.
That is a very good closing remark to remind us of the big picture on that. So with that, can I ask the audience for a round of applause? This was a fantastic discussion. Dr. Jones?
Just briefly before we let you go, just wanted to thank all of the panelists for a fantastic panel that, Cynthia, I'm not even sure we needed you to moderate. They had a lot of ability to just discuss amongst themselves. Just a couple other things before we go. I do want to take a minute and thank all of the staff that made this happen. So everybody here that's sitting before computers and the cameras back here, to Christine and Alexander and Katie and all of the staff in both the International Security Program and the Europe Program that made this happen. Thank you all. You folks did all the legwork to make this happen. So if you could help me congratulate all of them. I also wanted to thank Bill and Matt Green and Leonardo for 13 years of partnership on this Global Security Forum. We've transitioned from the days where you guys worked with Deputy Secretary of Defense Kath Hicks. She's moved on, we've moved on here, but I think that relationship stands strong. The irony here is I think you guys timed it perfectly with a $1 billion deal on the Columbia class. The news broke within the last 24 hours, so congratulations on that before our Global Security Forum. And then just lastly, as we started off this morning on the evolving threat landscape in Europe and also touched on the Indo-Pacific and the Chinese. I think, one of the key themes that I have come away with is whether it's the U.S.'s allies and partners in Europe or whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, that we're talking about much more than just war fighting and even deterrence. We wanted to end this on the industrial base to also highlight the importance of coordination, integration across the industrial bases, because as we're seeing with very complex weapons systems, C2, and a range of other complex commercial and dual-use systems, that there is really a need for growing partnership across multiple different countries and trusted countries. So we ended on this for that very reason. But thanks again for participating both online and here. And thanks again to this last panel for hitting on a high note. Have a great day.